Making your own homemade bacon from scratch seems complicated, but really it's quite a simple process. There are a couple of things you have to pay close attention to and make sure that you do right, but all in all, there's nothing especially difficult about taking a whole pork belly and turning it into your own bacon. So in this video, we're going to break it down into the most basic of steps, making it about as foolproof as possible. And I am going to be finishing my bacon on the smoker, although if you don't have a smoker, you can also do it in a regular oven. And when we're done, we'll have the most beautiful slab of tasty, delicious, amazing homemade bacon. I got this pork belly at BJ's Wholesale, which is a warehouse type store in certain states that's similar to Costco or Sam's Club if you're not familiar. And while most of the pork bellies I saw there on that particular day were kind of thin and sad looking, this one looked very nice. I definitely recommend trying to find a pork belly that's nice and thick if possible, so your eventual strips of bacon won't be super narrow. Anyway, after patting it dry with some paper towel, there isn't really any trimming or further prep work needed, and that means we're ready to start measuring our seasonings and cure. First, I'll weigh the pork belly, so I know exactly how much salt and cure I'll need. This thing is weighing in at 2,445 grams, and the ratios of my salt and cure are as follows: 2% salt, 0.25% curing salt, also called Prague Powder number 1, and the ratio I like for my sugar content for a standard bacon is 1.5%, though you can add as much or as little sugar as you want. So that means I need to weigh out 48.9 grams of kosher salt, 6.1 grams of curing salt, and 36.7 grams of my brown sugar. And my only other seasoning for this particular bacon will be some black pepper. I'm going with 1 tablespoon of coarse black pepper. Then I'll combine the salt, cure, sugar, and pepper together and mix it until everything is completely incorporated. And just to mention one more time, the amount of salt and cure is the one thing you really have to pay attention to when making bacon from scratch. Don't eyeball it, don't use teaspoons or tablespoons, you really need to weigh it out and use the proper ratios. If you don't use enough, your pork won't be fully cured, which can lead to sickness. And if you use too much, your bacon will be way too salty. And if you use way too much, it too can lead to sickness. Now to apply the mixture all over the pork belly. I'll make sure to use every last bit of this curing mixture and apply it to all sides and surfaces. With this method of curing, I've measured and am using the exact amount of salt and cure that I need, so I need to make sure that every last bit of it gets applied to the meat. That means scraping and squeegeeing the granules from my cutting board and getting as much of them as humanly possible onto the pork belly. The next step is to wrap this thing up and let it cure. You can tightly wrap the pork belly in at least 2 layers of plastic wrap, but my preferred method is to vacuum seal it using my FoodSaver. If you don't have a vacuum seal machine or particularly wide vacuum seal bags, you're fine to just use plastic wrap. Though I do recommend also putting the whole wrapped pork belly into a large 2-gallon Ziploc, or at least on a baking sheet, just in case there is any dripping or seepage that you don't want getting all over your fridge. Now my pork belly is ready to go into the fridge and cure for the next 7 to 10 days. Between now and then, I will not do anything to it, with one exception. Once per day, I'll go ahead and flip it over, just to make sure it cures evenly and any juices that have been drawn out have a chance to be evenly distributed across the entire slab of meat. And thanks to the miracle of movie magic, here we are a week later. Or, well, it's been more like 9 days, which is perfectly fine. And we're ready to finish off this bacon. So I'll pull it out of the vacuum seal bag and give it a thorough rinse with cold water under the faucet, just to rinse off any excess cure or salt that may not have fully absorbed. Then I'll slap it onto a wire rack and pat it relatively dry with some paper towel. The next step is to stick this whole thing back into the fridge for between 4 and 12 hours. Some people swear you have to wait the full 12 hours, so a sort of tacky surface called a pellicle develops on the meat, and some people don't do this step at all. Me, I think going about 4 hours is the perfect amount of time, and well, my bacon turns out great. Now this thing is finally ready to cook, which is a necessary step in making bacon. Bacon from the store looks and feels like raw meat, but in most cases it is in fact fully cooked. And I will be doing that in the smoker, so I'll go ahead and get some lump charcoal lit up, and into the Oklahoma Joe offset it goes along with a small chunk of maple wood. Once the smoker comes up to a temperature of 200 degrees Fahrenheit, in goes the bacon. I'll leave it right there on the wire rack so I can easily pull it all back out when the time comes. And of course I'll stick one of my thermometer probes in there so I know exactly when it's time to take the meat back out. Now I'll just let this smoke away for somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 hours, doing my best to maintain that heat in the 200 to 225 degree range. And by the way, if you don't have a smoker or just don't feel like smoking your slab of bacon, you can absolutely do this step in the oven. The oven temp and the internal bacon temp are the same as I'm doing here, except just use the oven instead. After about an hour, you can see it's started taking on some color and is looking more bacony by the minute. A couple hours later, once the internal temp of that bacon reaches 155, it's looking absolutely gorgeous and I'm pulling it out. I'll loosely cover it with some aluminum foil while letting it cool on the countertop. I'm not trying to seal it up, rather just keep it from drying out as it cools. I'll let it come nearly down to room temperature before doing what is almost certainly my least favorite step, putting this mouth-watering slab of bacon back into the fridge until tomorrow. And that's because I intend to slice this bacon into strips, and that's going to be so much easier when it's cold and firmed up from being in the refrigerator for several hours. So I'll wrap it up in some plastic wrap and have bittersweet bacon dreams until tomorrow. Okay, it's the next day, and at long last I can finally slice up this bacon and give it a taste. And while I could certainly get much thinner and more consistent strips if I were to use the electric meat slicer, I'm not actually sure my slicer is big enough for a slab of meat this size. So I'll just use a sharp knife and end up with some pretty thick and glorious strips of this beautiful bacon. Now there's only one thing left to do, and I think you know what it is. I've got the flat top heated up, and now we're just frying some bacon. My, quote, secret to perfectly fried bacon isn't really a secret at all, but seems to elude a lot of bacon cookers nevertheless. And that's to just not cook it too hot. Frying on a nice medium heat for a little longer is going to render down that fat, crisp up the edges, and produce what is, in my opinion, the most perfect strip of fried bacon. And when you watch me take a bite of this lightly crispy, thick strip of amazing bacon, tell me with a straight face that your mouth isn't watering just a little bit. Perfect amount of saltiness, a hint of sweet, a hint of pepper, absolutely delicious, which is exactly why this is my regular go-to for a classic bacon recipe. So that's about it. Not really all that complicated. As long as you really figure out and dial in the proper amount of salt and cure to put on your pork belly, it's really hard to screw up. And if you don't already have one, you're gonna need to get a kitchen scale. And when it comes to measuring cure in the tenths of a gram, you have to get one that is a little bit more of a high precision scale rather than, say, a standard postal scale or something like that. It needs to be able to measure down to a tenth of a gram, and I really like this scale because it's pretty cheap and it will measure plenty of weight. There's not a real low upper weight limit on it, but it will also measure all the way down to a tenth of a gram, which is perfect for basically all of my kitchen needs, whether it be meat curing or bread making or anything else. And if you don't have a scale and you're interested in checking out this one, I'll put a link to it in the video description below. Now I can take this bacon and do whatever I want with it. Super thin strips, real thick cut strips, cubes, chunks, bits, anything. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future meat curing and smoking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.